First, can we say that there won't be a one-on-one Zelensky-Putin meeting at the moment?
Yes, absolutely. I think this whole idea of a Putin Zelensky meeting was something that Trump came up with. The Russians never have shown any interest in it, and I think the Russians actually were rather irritated at the way in which this was all presented as something that they'd agreed to when they never did.
Mhm.
So this is very like Trump, as we've discussed many times. He
Mhm.
goes out and pretends that people have agreed to things when they've done nothing of the sort. And he gave the impression that the Russians had agreed to a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, which they've never done. I mean,
Mhm.
Putin has always said that, if the circumstances are right, if there's something meaningful to discuss
Mhm.
with Zelensky, he has no objection in principle to meeting with Zelensky,
Mhm.
but he doesn't think that this is an appropriate thing to do at the moment.
Well, then the confusing part is the Europeans, they are discussing on Tuesday, they're
Mhm.
discussing to send in troops. They call them peace, as French and British troops to go to
Yeah.
Ukraine as part of the peace agreement. What are they talking about? So there is no
Well,
ceasefire right now.
there is no peace agreement. The Russians have said that they will never accept European troops in Ukraine. That for them, this is an absolute red line that they're not going to move
Uh-huh.
from. And I mean, they've been saying that for years. So I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think there's any doubt about this. They've also said that the kind of security guarantees that the Europeans are talking about, which would involve the deployment of these so-called peacekeepers, are unacceptable to them.
Mhm.
And of course, the Russians hold a veto over this whole process because this can only happen if they agree
Mhm.
and the war ends. So the Europeans are doing something which in Europe, in the West, we do an awful lot. And this is again something that people in China perhaps need to get used to. What we do is we spend an enormous amount of time negotiating with each other about things that the other side has already rejected. So, the other side says, "Well, no, we're not going to agree to this."
Mhm.
But we've put out the proposal where lots of different countries, we all go out, we all start talking and discussing how it's all going to work and how we're going to put troops here and we're going to put troops there and we're going to arrange the logistics and all of that. So we spend perhaps a year talking about all of this with each other. And then we come along to the other side and then we present the proposal to them. And the other side says, no, we've always said, we've always said no.
Mhm.
You weren't listening. And this is, if you were familiar with negotiations between Russia and the West, going back all the way to the start of the Cold War,
Mhm.
you would know this happens again and again and again and again, and it makes these negotiations incredibly difficult. And you're going to find when as the relationship between the West and China evolves and unfortunately starts to become hostile, you're going to see the same pattern recur. So you're going to see the
Mhm.
Europeans, the Americans floating a proposal. China says no.
Mhm. I
The
mean,
Americans, the Europeans pay no attention. They spend months and weeks discussing how the proposal is going to work. Then they come along and they present it to Wang Yi, and Wang Yi says no. And then the whole thing has to start all over again, usually after a lot of astonishment and confusion in the West that this proposal that they've been working on for such a long time has got nowhere.
but Trump does seems to change his position a little bit because he told the Fox News, he said when it comes to the security, they're willing, meaning the Europeans are willing to put people on the ground. We're willing to help them with things, especially probably you could talk about by air. So Trump
Yeah.
seems like almost like give his permission for European to put troops and US will help out. That sounds like his position right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It is his position. I mean, he's changed his position. He said previously that he would not support, he would not give security guarantees to European force if it went to Ukraine. Now he's sort of giving the impression that he will, except if you analyze his words carefully, which is perhaps a dangerous thing to do with Donald Trump's words, he doesn't actually say that. He says that the Americans would provide all kinds of assistance, but he never quite says that if the Europeans got into serious trouble with the Russians in Ukraine, that the Americans would come to their rescue. And the Federalist, which is an interesting magazine in the United States, not widely read, but it is part of what you might call the intellectual wing of the MAGA movement, has now published an article which is clearly a warning to Trump, which says that his base will not support giving security guarantees to the Europeans to go to Ukraine. So this is, I think, what the American. I think that I don't myself think that we're going to see any real security guarantees from the US either to Ukraine itself or to the Europeans to go to Ukraine. I think the Americans will pull back, but that isn't stopping people in Europe from continuing to talk about this. And Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, is now talking about this. And he's now talking about German troops being sent to Ukraine as part of this so-called peacekeeping force. And I cannot imagine anything more likely to enrage the Russians and to provoke them than that. And I just wanted to explain to Chinese people how the Russians would feel about that. It's the equivalent of Japan saying it would send a peacekeeping force to Taiwan. I mean, it's just something that is just, it's such a crazy idea. You just wonder how a German leader could even think about it.
The European public is against it. There is no question about that. But
No.
I wonder whether they're talking this, oh, this is a part of the peace agreement, that they're kind of like trying to, I don't know, lie to the public or confuse the public, make the public believe this is some kind of peacekeeping thing rather than combat thing. Is that what they're trying to confuse the public?
Well, that is exactly what they're trying to do, except that the European public can see through all of this, because in Britain, in France, and even more in Germany, people are against this. I mean, they don't like this idea at all. Neither, by the way, do the soldiers. I mean, none of the armies are in any condition to carry out this kind of operation. All of them know that they're in no condition to take on the Russian army. So I mean, they don't want to do this at all. This is a very strange plan, and I think there are various explanations for it. One is that the Europeans want to show that they still have some kind of relevance, that they're still powerful, that they still have armies to send. The armies may number, less than the Shanghai police force taken together, but they still exist. So they want to persuade everybody that Europe still has armies, and that there's still a power, and that the Americans should listen to them, and the Russians should listen to them, and the Chinese should listen to them. So there's that element. The second is that they want, as you rightly said, to spin this out to the European public, to keep the European public still on board with this whole conflict and agreeing to the money being sent to Ukraine, because they're giving the impression that there is some kind of diplomatic and peace initiative still underway, and it's all going to end well, and peace is round the corner, and we're going to send our troops there, and this terrible man, Mr. Putin, will be defeated in some way in the end. So all of this activity creates that impression, and it's things that people write about in the newspapers and can talk about on the television. And as I said, it's action that actually doesn't mean anything. It's activity. It's not action. It is activity rather than action. And I think the third thing, and I think this is the most sinister side of it, is that I think at some level, some European leaders probably do know that this is unacceptable to the Russians, and that the reason they are talking in this way is because they want the war to go on. because they don't want the war to end. Because if the war ends, the Americans, they always worry that the Americans might leave. And they're also worried that they're going to have to explain to the people of Europe why so much of their money was spent on this war to no good purpose.
And then Zelensky also he rules out China as a security guarantor. He also again mentioned that the Budapest memorandum. So what exactly? Now we talked about this last time. You
Yeah.
explained it, but what is China and France role in this memorandum? We didn't talk about
None,
that.
none that I can remember. I mean, that at that time, you're talking about the early 90s now.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope people in China won't be offended when I say this, but nobody took China seriously in those
At the
days. I
time.
mean, the idea that the Americans, the Russians, and the Europeans would even think about China playing a role in the security affairs of Europe was just impossible.
Yeah.
And when President Xi Jinping um, put out his peace ideas, was it 2 years ago? I
Mhm.
said already that was going to be something very difficult for the West to accept, that China was actually
Mhm.
putting forward proposals to
Yeah.
achieve peace in Europe. This is something that the Europeans would struggle to even consider or think of. It was certainly even less likely in 1994. But I just do want to say something about Zelensky. I mean, we have seen a steady evolution in Zelensky's attitude to China
Mhm.
and Ukraine's attitude to China.
Yeah.
I mean, with every month, he becomes more hostile.
Yeah.
He makes all kinds of allegations against China. And he treats China now, where at one point he was almost suggesting that China might be a potential mediator. He's now treating China as if it was an enemy.
Mhm.
Now, I mean, I think this is stupidity beyond reason, actually, because the very last thing that Zelensky should want to do is to make China an enemy and to refuse even to consider the idea of China acting as a guarantor is, well, first of all, it's offensive to China, which
Mhm.
has made a serious effort to find a way to end the war.
Mhm.
But secondly, it's been done in a way that suggests that China is an ally of Russia. If China really became an ally of Russia and started to involve itself in the war, well, I mean, I suspect the war would be over very quickly.
Yeah.
Is all I can say.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I was looking at this, Budapest Memorandum. Now, the signatories are Russia, Ukraine, United States, United Kingdom, right? So those are the people
Yeah,
who signed.
yeah,
I think later, China and France, they basically endorsed it. So that they
yeah,
are Security Council member. So
yeah,
they basically
exactly.
saying, we're happy to see that you guys signed this, but
Yeah,
they play no role in it. They
no, no,
just
of course not.
endorse the memorandum.
No.
Okay.
Yes, yes,
But
exactly.
Zelensky claimed that somehow China also promised to guarantee
Well,
something.
well,
That's
as I've said
at all.
already, I mean, Zelensky spins myths, spins stories about the Budapest memorandum. He does this all the time, and it's very difficult to keep up with this. Um, the document is there. Anybody can read it.
Yeah.
Anybody can see what the reality was.
Mhm.
Anybody can go back into the time and read what the other agreements that were reached at that time actually were and can find out the truth. Very few people take the trouble. And the result is that Zelensky's unending procession of stories just goes circling around,
Mhm.
and people assume that they are true. To repeat again, there were no guarantees of the kind that Zelensky's talking about in the Budapest memorandum. China certainly did not give any guarantees. There is no reason why what happened why China cannot give guarantees to Ukraine now.
Mhm.
The idea that it's somehow unable to do so because it didn't fulfill guarantees under the Budapest memorandum is nonsensical. I mean, it is preposterous but it is Zelensky. And in a way, this gives a good example to Chinese people of one of the major intractable problems of this conflict, that you have a leader of one of the two parties, Zelensky, who does this sort of thing.
He's. I think there's a lot of discussion on the social media about this, and people pointed out different things. I think some of them do make sense. One thing he seems like very angry with China. He said that China hasn't provided any help to us, but that's not true. China sent a lot of aid, but the aid are for like civilians, like clothes and diapers and formula, those sort of thing. There are no weapons. He want weapons from China. I think that's the thing that angers him, probably among other things. I
Yeah, I
think.
mean, which is absurd.
Yeah.
I mean, it completely contradicts Chinese foreign policy.
Yeah.
I mean, China is not providing weapons to Russia.
No,
China is
exactly.
not providing weapons to Ukraine.
Hmm.
So what is he complaining about?
Yeah. Yeah.
China has an economic relationship with Russia,
Mhm.
and it has tried to maintain an economic relationship with Ukraine. It
Yeah.
is cheating both countries in the same way. Obviously, it has a strategic partnership with Russia.
Mhm.
All the world knows it.
Yeah.
But that has not meant that China has played any direct role in the conflict in Ukraine at all. I was reading, by the way, Ukrainian commentator, an important military commentator, discussing drones and the kind of drones that each side uses. And he says the Russians get 2/3 of their technology from China, from the civilian Chinese industry. And we get all of ours from China too. We both rely on Chinese drone technology to keep our drones working. So, I
Yeah.
mean, there you have it.
Yes, that's another thing that people are talking about, that China, doesn't sell military drones to anybody.
No,
The civilian drones is open to everyone.
absolutely.
Ukraine buys that too. It's not just Russian. And then they do some
Exactly.
changes with their civilian
Yeah,
ones. Well, that's something China cannot control. Okay.
absolutely. Well,
So
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And the Chinese government is always very measured. So this is what the Chinese government says. China is open to constructive role in this regard, and China has always acted openly and above board on Ukraine crisis, adhering to an objective and a fair stance, and all parties are well aware of this. So even though I think it's measured, but China is a little bit irritated. You can hear, all parties, that's
Yeah.
including Ukraine. You know that, right? Is that kind of a
Yeah.
little bit irritated?
They are irritated, got every right to be, because Zelensky, a year, 2 years ago, he was agreeing. He was saying this. He too was saying this, that China had an open, transparent role.
Mhm.
I mean, he was going out of his way to have good relations with China. I can remember when was it he telephoned Xi Jinping at one
Uh-huh,
point,
yeah,
and the
yeah,
Americans were very annoyed about it. By
I
the way,
bet.
I remember.
Yeah.
But I mean, he was reaching out to the Chinese, and then of course, as I said, gradually, as he's projected himself as the great champion of the West,
Mhm.
as he's become increasingly influenced by his friends in the Baltic states and in all
Yeah.
of those places, as he's wanted to make friends with people like Senator Graham in the United States, he's
Mhm.
taken an ever more extreme anti-China stance. To repeat again, if China did all the things that the West claims
Mhm.
in Ukraine, in the conflict would now be over and
Mhm.
Russia would have won. It's as simple as that. Anybody who doesn't know that or doesn't understand that is a fool.
And the other thing is that somebody also pointed out that China has been buying agriculture products from Ukraine.
Yeah,
Europeans doesn't. They
yeah,
protected their own agriculture
yeah,
market.
yeah.
So actually, they don't buy. They're banned from
Yes,
buying the Ukrainian agriculture products. China is the one who's buying. So
correct.
so
So
what's their?
again, I mean, it's what's called biting the hand that feeds you, because China is providing trade and is trying to keep some parts of the Ukrainian economy still functioning.
Mhm.
But and as I said, China is tried to fulfill a mediation role. Li Hui,
Yeah.
Li, yeah, I mean he's
Envoy.
tried. He's been to Kiev. He wasn't treated very kindly there, properly there, in my opinion. But China has made efforts.
Yeah.
We see where it's all gone. Um, but this is a lens. This is. I'm sorry to say this. This is. I mean, Ukraine is very let down by the quality of its leader. Many Ukrainians say this too, by the way. Um, um, Another leader would avoid talking about China in this way. And it's not just the Chinese who are irritated by Zelensky. Prime Minister Modi of India doesn't like him. President Lula of Brazil was infuriated when he agreed to meet Zelensky at a G7 meeting, which both of them were invited to, and Zelensky didn't turn up to the meeting. MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is now not to like Zelensky very much either. I mean, he has this way which offends people, except it must be said in Europe.
In general, I must say, part of the reason China trying to be as neutral as possible is before, actually, I think China and Ukraine always had a pretty good relationship.
They
I think it's changed also in 2014, that after the Maidan coup, isn't it? It's getting
Yeah,
worse.
it's true. I mean, it started to deteriorate afterwards, but even afterwards, right up until the very start of the special military operation, China was a big investor in
Yeah.
Ukraine. It wanted to invest, I remember, in the Zaporozhye um, gas turbine plant. The United States didn't want that, and I remember that they took steps to prevent it happening. Um, um, China always strove to be on good terms with Ukraine. But I'm going to say something, and I hope now, I mean, I'm not telling Chinese people about their own foreign policy, but my own sense of China is that anyway, it doesn't like to get involved in other people's quarrels. So I mean, it's if the Russians and the China and the Ukrainians have issues with each other, the Chinese instinct is to say, well, this isn't our concern. We would prefer countries to get on with each other. We would like them to mediate if they want us to help to mediate between them. But it's not our business to pick sides.
Yeah.
I think that is very much the tradition of Chinese foreign policy altogether.
And China doesn't want, the same is true that China doesn't want other countries to tell China what to do, interfere with China's domestic policies. Yeah.
Correct. Exactly. Exactly.
So China
Exactly.
consistent, right? Don't bother
Uh,
me. I'm not bothering you either, right? So
correct.
it's all taking
Correct.
care of each other's business
Correct.
themselves.
Correct. And I think this is a very, very much part of China's foreign policy, in fact, general policy DNA. So
Yeah.
I mean, I hope Chinese people don't take it amiss that I say that. But I mean, I find Chinese stance relative to the war in Ukraine completely consistent
Mhm.
in terms of Chinese foreign policy
Yeah.
as a whole.
Yeah. 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 It is consistent, and you're absolutely right. China in general wants to trade with
Yeah.
everyone, right?
Everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, everybody, but
Yeah.
doesn't want to get interfere, into domestic policies of any country. Yeah, that's
Exactly.
yeah. The West doesn't seem to understand that. They somehow believe
No,
China is taking side. China doesn't want to take side.
correct.
So-
Correct. The extraordinary thing is the Russians understand it.
yeah.
I mean, you could argue. I mean, the Russians ought to be annoyed. I mean, they. I
Yeah.
mean, if they applied Western type thinking,
Yeah.
they could say to the Chinese, "Look, you're our strategic partner. Why are you still trading with
Yeah.
Ukraine? Why are you still, talking to these people in
Mhm.
the way that you are?" The Russians never do that.
Yeah.
I mean, they've learnt enough. They've understood China well enough to know that that wouldn't be welcome there,
Mhm.
and they work very hard on their side to try to understand China's foreign policy and what it's about. And on the contrary, they've shown understanding and appreciation of it. The Russians understand it. The West never does. By the way, just before I started this program, I was reading an utterly paranoid article. I'm sorry, there's many of these paranoid articles about China in the British media, talking about Ukraine, talking about China's infiltration of Britain. I mean, crazy stuff by the former leader of the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan Smith, who is somebody whose views about China are just crazy. But he is fairly typical. Either you're with us, either you're 100% with us, or you're 100% against us. And that's the attitude that these people have.
That's yeah, I noticed that too. You know, George W. Bush said that, right? You either agree, you know, with us or against us. So you have to take side, even though
You have to
I
take
actually
sides.
I actually think a majority of the countries don't want to take side. It's not just
No,
China doesn't want. I think a majority of people don't want to get involved. In
exactly.
yeah, and honestly, I actually do think China is correct to believe that if nobody is involved in these things, they somehow will find ways resolve themselves. I
Yes.
mean, if you look at like Gaza, there's also criticism for China not to helping the Palestinians enough.
Yeah.
Now, China's view is if nobody, the United States in particular, if the United States is not in there to mess things up, there will be a solution. They will find a solution. I actually
Correct.
think that's correct. Yeah.
They are absolutely correct. Again, I mean, I speak now as a person who used to do much mediation and things of this kind. The one way to aggravate any kind of dispute is when self-interested third parties
Yeah.
involve themselves in it. I mean, that absolutely guarantees that any dispute uh, will then
Yeah.
develop into an all-out conflict and then will become much more difficult to resolve. This is absolutely right. I mean, it is true in life and it is true in the world of diplomacy as well.
Yeah. And the Ukraine and the Russian, if not the NATO was so heavily involved, and not the US has been, you know, was under Biden,
Yes.
was, yeah, they would have resolved it probably in this 2022, right? They had this uh, Turkey meeting that they would probably have resolved that.
Well,
Yeah.
they would have resolved it. I
Hmm.
mean, the document had been initialed.
Hmm.
Zelensky had made a speech in which he said that he supported it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the the British and the Americans came, and they said no. That meant that the conflict continued, with the results we all see.
The South Korea president, Lee Jae Myung, he visited the U.S. Now, several things. One is the Korean media was very unhappy about it because they compared how he was received with how Putin was received. Now, I do think there's a little bit stretch to compare the two, but okay, that they don't like the optics of it.
Yeah.
What is your view? What do you think that they both sides, U.S. and the South Korea, want to get out of this?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the South Koreans expecting that they would be treated in the same way as the leader of a superpower, which is of course Russia, is expecting rather a lot. I have to say this, but against that, I mean, I think the South Koreans perhaps don't quite fully understand two things about the United States. Firstly, the United States takes South Korea completely for granted. As far as the Americans are concerned, South Korea is a vassal state. The Americans don't have to really do very much because the job of the South Koreans is to do as they're told and to come to the imperial capital and to be, received by the emperor and to, prostrate themselves before him and to take whatever instructions the emperor, the president of the United States, hands down to them. That is, I think, very much the American view. It's not something the Americans would say, perhaps even to each other, but it's what deep down they all think. The second is that I think Donald Trump doesn't like South Korea very much because, as far as he's concerned, South Korea is a country that runs a big trade surplus with the United States, that produces all the various things that the United States once produced. But now South Korea does it better. So the Americans used to make televisions. The South Koreans make better televisions. The South Koreans make microchips. The Americans don't. All of those kind of things. So I don't think he likes South Korea very much. I don't think Donald Trump has ever really felt very comfortable in Asia altogether, if I have to say.
They did mention that he seems to want to meet Kim Jong Un again.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, we will see whether that happens, but it's
Yeah.
interesting. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, okay, let's talk deep state, because last
Yeah.
time in our conversation you mentioned
Mm.
Albert Kobe, A. West Mitchell. So quite a few of my viewers, a Chinese viewer, want us to talk about the deep state.
Yeah.
Now, how do you define deep state as a concept is kind of strange for Chinese audience. Can you define that for us?
It is very strange because China has nothing like it. I mean, it is the political system in China makes the emergence of such a thing completely impossible. The deep state is part of, but not identical to, the bureaucracy of certain key Western countries. Obviously, the United States, Britain. Britain has an important deep state. France
Mhm.
also. Germany too. Those are Italy. I mean,
Mhm.
now the point about the deep state in all of these countries is that it's partly part of the bureaucracy,
Okay.
but it is also exists outside it. People who exercise power without having any official position at all.
Mhm. Mhm.
And they are not necessarily businessmen. They're just extremely well connected people. They have roles in the intelligence services. They have role in the academic world that is very important and very powerful. They have various social connections. And taken together, they constitute what might be described as the permanent government of Western countries.
Mhm.
And they also form the attitudes that these countries have, which exist outside formal politics. So we have elections,
Mhm.
we have political parties, the political parties change,
Mhm.
but the overall course of policy always remains the same. And because many of these people are invisible and unknown, this is a power that is wielded entirely unaccountably. Because one can't dismiss someone like this if they're not even part of the bureaucracy. You can't dismiss them.
Uh-huh.
If you don't know who they are exactly, you can't hold them to account
Mhm.
personally.
Yeah. Okay.
But they all meet often in private settings. They often function, especially in the United States, through
Mhm.
think tanks, which are quasi academic
Mhm. Yeah.
institutions. And they all talk to each other and bounce ideas off each other. And as I said, they form the policies of their respective countries. And they wield enormous power in the West. And they are the real power in the West.
Well, then the question is, why are they so powerful? So you're saying they have a network, right? So it's not
Yeah.
one person; they
And
have a
no,
network of people.
they're a
And we
network.
don't know all of them, right? Even
Yes.
for people who had paid lots of attention, like you and me, we still don't know all of them either, right? But
Yes.
they kind of know each other, and they're always there, right? They somehow
Yes.
always in the
Yeah.
government or
Yes.
around it, the think tanks and the universities.
Yes.
Okay. So then and like you said, you can't hold them accountable. So what do? You can't do anything about them. They just have to be there.
Well, there would have to be in every Western country a serious attempt to change the political system. I mean, there would need to be a straightforward attempt to break their power. That has never happened. I mean, for a brief moment after Trump was elected, when Elon Musk was going around with Doge, he
Mhm.
seemed to be doing some of the things that might actually expose some of the nature of their power. It was you who told me
Mhm.
on one of our earlier programs, for example,
Mhm.
how we discovered that part of the budget system in the United States involved funds which were completely unaccountable and of which even the president himself was not informed. So, but of course, you see how quickly Elon Musk was sidelined and then pushed away. You would need an outright political revolution to break their power. How do these people exercise this power? It's because they always have done, especially in the European countries, but also in the United States. These people come from families which have a very, very old, long footprint in the political system. In Britain, for example, I worked in the legal system, and I can tell you for an absolute fact that many of the judges, many of the people who work in the legal system belong to families that have been working in the legal system since at least the 17th century, and since the time of the Ming emperors, to give China its history. The same is true in France, even more so perhaps in France. The same is true in Italy and Germany. In the United States, it goes back at least to the mid-19th century, to the period immediately after the American Civil War, when the political class in America began to form and to crystallize and to take the shape that it does today. So they are people who are used to power, who go to the same schools, who go to the same universities, who meet each other on a social level, who are connected with the power systems, who are their friends, who go into the intelligence agencies, who are their friends who go into the civil service. And remember, it's much easier for these people to get into the civil service because if we wanted to get into the civil service in any of these countries, we would face many, many obstacles. But the way is always smoothed for people like this because they will have friends there. And they have already got friends there. So, they'll say, Fred wants to go and join the State Department and let's see what job we can get him. The exams will be organized for Fred in a certain way so that he'll pass through. Anyway, so all of this goes on. And the result is it's self-perpetuating. And these people also are connected to big money. This is also part of the system of the deep state because capital in the West depends on the state. They're integrated with each other. So I'm going to give an example, which again, I think people in China will perhaps understand. There's been an awful lot of talk in the West about the housing bubble in China. And about the fact that certain financial institutions in China got involved in overinvestment in the property businesses and all of that. The universal assumption in the West, and one of the things that has caused enormous degree of surprise and also anger because a lot of Westerners invested in the Chinese market property industry, is that the Chinese government hasn't bailed out the housing markets, the property markets in China. It hasn't come to the help of the various financial institutions there that were involved in this. In the West, it is taken as axiomatic that government will prevent these sort of financial institutions from collapsing. You saw that in 2008 during the financial crisis. You saw that during the pandemic when there was another bailout by Western governments of all the institutions that worked in the stock markets, in the financial institutions. They were all left open. They received huge amount of government subsidies at that time. So what then happens is that there is this, as it's called, they all work together. So when you leave the civil service, you go into a bank or a financial institution or into the arms industry, which is another part of the whole networks that exist. So big capital in the West. I mean, for one thing, please ignore all the talk about free markets and all of that sort of thing that you read about.
Yeah.
There is no such thing. I mean, I worked on the fringes of
Mhm.
the financial markets. I know there are no free markets anywhere in the world.
Mhm.
That concept has no reality behind it. It certainly doesn't exist in the West. I mean, except in certain economic textbooks. It doesn't exist in the West. And it certainly doesn't exist today. And you have this merger of people within the bureaucratic systems in law, in the big
Mhm.
law firms, in the big accountancy firms,
Mhm.
in the big financial institutions, and of course in government. And they all reinforce each other. They all, as you rightly say, belong to the same social classes. They all know each other. They all have their influence in the media, which of course they own.
Mhm.
And they also have their enormous influence over the political system. And taken together, they are the deep state. And they meet. And they meet in various places. They meet in Davos in Europe.
Mhm.
They also meet in the various places in the United States, in Jackson Hole, in Martha's Vineyard. You're invited to these places, then you belong to this world.
So, in other words, this whole group of people, they move
Yeah,
around, right, within the
yeah,
government, the think
yeah,
tanks,
yeah, yeah.
universities, and
Yes,
corporations. So they move
yes,
around,
yes,
and they have deep root, going back, like even like Albert Colby, right? His grandfather
yes.
was the first CIA director, isn't it?
Correct. Absolutely. William Colby. Absolutely. And
Yeah.
undoubtedly, he will have connections still in the intelligence agencies. Wes Mitchell, that we were talking about, apparently also has deep roots. And of course, he was himself in the Department of Defense, I understand. So,
Uh-huh.
this whole self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating network is still there. I remember watching some years ago the film, Lincoln. You remember the
Mhm. Yes.
Steven Spielberg film?
Uh-huh. Lincoln.
I'm sure you remember some of the congressmen that appear there, including the one who proposed the 13th Amendment to the House of Representatives. Surprise,
Okay.
surprise. He's one of his descendants is still in the House of Representatives. So you can see how it continues. And in Britain, it has been the same. Now,
And
that cannot reproduce itself in China.
no.
It is an impossible system. You remember when we discussed this talk about princelings and
Uh-huh.
people within
Uh-huh.
the
Yeah.
Chinese Communist Party, and
Mhm.
I said that this was very, very different from what we have in the West.
Yeah.
I think I've explained now more
Mhm.
fully in this program why it is so different. For one thing, these princelings, of whom we're not talking about huge
Mhm.
numbers of people anyway, but they are visible.
Yes.
These
Uh-huh.
people mostly are not.
No. Okay. Yeah. Plus, they also actually bipartisan, right? They on the
Oh yeah,
surface, there's two parties fighting each other, but at this level, they don't, right?
no,
They're together. One thing you
absolutely,
notice is Albert Jacoby and Amos Mitchell. You told me that they're friends, and then I looked
yes,
them up, and they they actually built this think tank called the Marathon Project. Um, and recently, this this marathon project or marathon initiative, and recently they announced on their website that they invited somebody called Eli Ratner to join them. And who is Eli Ratner? He was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs in the Biden administration. So they work
well, there you
together, right? So
absolutely,
so
absolutely.
there's another deep state person, Eli
If
Ratner.
you
Yeah.
want to know what the true foreign policy of the United States is,
Mhm.
I think you shouldn't pay the place to really go
Mhm.
more than what the president says or the
Yeah.
secretary of state says
Mhm.
is look through the publications of the think tanks.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
There are huge numbers of them,
Yeah.
and they churn out material. And it's, by the way, almost unbearable to read. I mean, it really is. And one of the things you quickly discover is that these people are nowhere near as clever as they believe they are either. That's one of the things that became obvious to me almost at once. But this is where real policy debate in the United States takes place. And if you track the people in think tank land, you will see how they move in and out of government, in and out of all of the academic institutions. It's their ideas that then get transmitted into the White House and which form the policy. And at the center of there's agencies like this, like the National Security Council. And if you remember, there was they referred to each other as the interagency, the various agencies that coordinate with each other. I mean, you could almost say that the interagency is a kind of code name for the deep state in the United States. A rather sinister name, by the way. Sounds like something out. That does sound a bit like something out of James Bond. But anyway, there it is.
Now, in terms of there's no free market, Trump just take Intel 10%, 9.9% stake from Intel, right? So this is to me like a nationalize Intel. But
well, it's exactly what it is. But I mean, this is one of the interesting things about Trump is that he pulls the mask off the system. I mean, he's now at the same time as he's nationalizing industries, he's also privatizing the state. Because there comes a point where, because the state will presumably start to receive dividends from Intel in the unlikely event that it ever makes a profit. So you can start to see how the two things are becoming a hybrid. But in truth, they have been that for a very, very long time now.
So this whole idea of free enterprises, a free market, fair competition, it's just a myth. It does.
I mean, what was in the 50s that the CEO of General Motors said, "What's good for General Motors is good for the United States."
Yeah. Now, we talked about last time, the meeting with Putin is to make peace with Russia so that together, the idea is to go against China. So he wants to do almost like a Nixon in reverse, right? So now, certainly, I don't think it's going to work. But within the deep state, within the United States, I think fundamentally they all agree they want to preserve the U.S. influence, the U.S. hegemony. But there is a difference in terms of who should be the priority, China or Russia, right? There is a difference there. But let's talk a little bit about the difference. The U.S.-Russia relationship is different from U.S.-China different, isn't it?
So it's profoundly different.
So the Russian and the U.S., they do have direct competitions, like in the energy market, in the military industry market, and the agriculture market. There is a direct competition, isn't it?
Yes,
but
absolutely
China doesn't.
True. No. I mean, the thing to understand about the American-Russian relationship is that, of course, these countries have been adversaries since the end of the Second World War, continuous adversaries. And in many, many ways, they do resemble each other. I mean, in ways that it is, it's more than just superficial. They're both territorially huge countries, not heavily populated. They both have an abundance of natural resources, or at least the United States used to, less so now perhaps, but certainly that has been the relative history. They're both continental economies. They're both self-sufficient, or at least America was a self-sufficient economy. And of course, the other thing is they're both ultimately countries that originate from within the European system. Russia was a European power. The United States originated as a European settler state and has become heavily involved in European affairs. So they each, in their own way, reflect aspects of European culture and European military and diplomatic culture as well. And they are the two big powers in Europe. And of course, after the Second World War, Europe was the main area of global competition because Europe was by far the most powerful continent for for centuries. And so there was this concept of the struggle for mastery of Europe. There's a famous book with that title, by the way, The Struggle for Mastery of Europe. And so the Russians and the Americans were struggling against each other. Now, the result was, at the same time as they were doing that, they got to know each other very, very well. I mean, Russian officials and American officials would meet. To some extent, certainly Russians would know English. There would be interactions. You'd have, at times, a kind of camaraderie emerging. And yeah, I saw this. I've seen this myself. I used to get invited. Well, I could still probably get invited if I wanted to the Russian embassy in Athens. And they would hold big parties there, and you'd see the Russian military attaché and the American military attaché. Oh, you see the head of the Russian intelligence agency there, and the American, and they would meet and they said, "Well, we got one over you in Kosovo. We were able to disrupt your plan here," and I mean, it was bizarre listening to this, but you would actually listening to this, and our fighter jets are better than your fighter jets, all this kind of thing. So there is, on the one hand, a kind of hardwired sense of rivalry because this has been going on for so long, and a genuine and deep distrust on the part of each country towards the other, and in some cases, not just a rivalry, but more than a rivalry, a positive hatred. I mean, it does exist, more on the American side than the Russian, but it does exist. And at the same time, there is a sense that, if we are rivals with the Russians, this is something we're familiar with, we're comfortable with, we kind of know the rules, or we have some kind of rules, we can interact with them, we can meet with them, it's something familiar. Then each country, when they encounter the Chinese, they come up with something completely unfamiliar and very different. The Americans more than the Russians, because again, the Americans have not really got used to the fact of Asians being equal to themselves, an equal party to themselves. And of course, they haven't got that sense of familiarity with China that they do with Russia. So on the one hand, you can see that there's the pull, focus on Russia. They're the enemy. Break the Russians. If we can break the Russians, we can then isolate the Chinese. The Chinese are the big enemy. They're the people we really want to come up against. And besides, we know the Russians so well. It's somehow betrayal that they don't come round to our way of thinking, because they should understand that it's the Chinese who are the real enemy, because, they're so different from us. We and the Russians are like each other in so many ways. Why did the Russians prefer to be with the Chinese instead of us? So you get a lot of that sense of the Americans. And the Russians went through all of that in the 50s and 60s. I mean, they interacted with the Chinese. Some Russians came to like China a lot, by the way, in the 1950s. I remember there was a Russian official called Ivan Arkhipov who was sent by Stalin to China, and he fell in love with China. He learned Chinese. He was coordinating a lot of the economic interactions between China and the Soviet Union at that time. But, there was also a lot of incomprehension and confusion and inability to understand China very well. I remember reading the memoirs of the Soviet foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, and his meetings with Mao. And he couldn't quite bring himself to understand how Mao could be so steeped in Chinese culture. He didn't understand Chinese culture himself. And you could see that, at some level, he felt that Chinese culture was this strange, inferior thing, and we Russians much superior to all of this. But then, of course, it all went wrong for the Russians, as they have never forgotten. I mean,
Mhm.
this is something that, again, people in the United States just don't get. But in the 60s and 70s, the Soviets, the Russians found themselves with competition with both China and the United States at the same time, and it broke them.
Mhm.
And the big lesson the Russians learned from that is never, never, ever get into a conflict with China again. There is no need to. There
Mhm.
is no need to. We can have good relations with China. Our longest border is with China.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is absolutely existentially important to us that we remain on good terms with China. And that means that we have to make an effort to get to understand China well. And you can see that in the last 20 years, especially since Putin's time, but even more since relations with the West collapsed in at the start of the Ukrainian crisis, you start to see that there's been a major effort in Russia to try to get to understand China. There are lots of Russian students now in China. There are Chinese students, by the way, in Russia. They're starting to try to learn each other, the Chinese language. They're starting to do those kind of things. So they had to fail in
Mhm.
order to learn,
Yeah.
and the Americans haven't yet reached that level.
Well, regarding the Americans, I agree with you that there is a deep, like a lack of understanding,
Yeah,
from the
yeah,
US side to understand China. But it's not like if they don't have opportunities or they don't have the people. During the time, the Red Scare, they got rid of a whole bunch of people who actually do know China. There is one guy in particular, I think his name is John S. Service. He grown up in China. He speaks like a 12 dialects of China. He's not
yeah.
one of those people who like to hang out just with the high-end people,
No,
the diplomatic circle. He's not that kind of person. He like to travel around China, talking to the farmers and that kind of a, countryside people. He's that kind of person. So he truly know China.
yes,
Well, you would think somebody like that would be very
yes,
helpful. The State Department, they got rid of him. They fired him.
yes,
So they had the opportunity to know more
yes,
about China, but they
yes, I know.
they blow it, So
Yes, they did blow it because again, I mean, it's a little bit like the Soviet. I mean, the Soviet
Mhm.
Union also had people in the 50s who knew about
Yeah.
China,
Uh-huh.
but the political leadership simply could not register the
Hmm.
fact that China is an equal country. The Soviets had this
Hmm.
problem in the 50s and
Okay.
60s. The Americans have it today. So people who understand and think about China and relate to China in the way that you're describing are not welcome in the halls of power.
Okay.
Certainly not in Washington today, certainly not in Moscow in
Hmm.
about 1960, just
Okay.
to say.
Hmm.
I ought to say something. I've told you I've got many books about China. About two-thirds of them are written by Americans. I
Okay.
mean, Americans have a much richer um, tradition of Chinese studies
Hmm.
than, say, Europeans do, any Europeans. If you're talking about Chinese painting, which, as you know, is a topic which I am
Hmm.
particularly interested in, I think pretty much every single book I have about Chinese painting is written by Americans. Because, of course,
Okay.
I mean, I read these, I learn about Chinese art,
Hmm.
in English. So it's invariably Americans. But I mean, these people, as I said, are pushed in, are pushed to the fringes. I have a friend in London, Kerry Brown, who is a professor at a British university. He loves China. He also speaks Chinese. He
Hmm.
travels around China a great deal.
Hmm.
He too has been pushed out
Yeah.
of any position of importance. So certainly, you're absolutely right. The expertise is there.
And if you think about it, China's economy actually complementary to the US, right?
Yeah,
China needs the US energy and soybean, for example. And so this fear of China is not necessarily China is like it, Russia direct competition. It just they don't like the fact that China is increasing its influence and also in a way present to world an alternative. That's where the
Yes.
US cannot stand to have a powerful China, right?
Well, it cannot stand an alternative. It cannot accept an equal. I mean,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
it's structurally unable to do that. I think there's something one needs to understand about the United States is what a very, very young country the
Yeah.
United States still is. And America, the United States, is very much a product of its war of independence, its revolution, its
Hmm.
constitution, and its conception of itself is that it is the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
it, it, so um, if America is not the future, if China is, which it's increasingly beginning to look to many Americans as it might be, then that is something that Americans find very difficult because
Yeah.
the future has to be them.
They don't seem to do much to look inside, domestically the problem the US
No,
has. They
no,
blame everything on others, like outsourcing of the jobs. It's China's fault
no.
or Mexico's
Yes,
fault. But if you look at closely, just recently there's some companies go under. Well, one part of it is this private equity. They are the one who destroy lots of the US companies,
true.
through financial means and just extremely, I don't know. I guess they're legal, but very questionable ways of doing business destroy companies, good companies like a Toys R Us and Sears and Red Lobster, one after another are destroyed by these private equities. Nobody's even talking about that.
No,
It's China's fault.
you're completely correct. I mean, I can remember in the 1980s when this began, this process of cannibalization
Mhm.
in Western economies began, and you had criticism of it then. You remember Oliver Stone did a film, Wall Street, which is
Yeah.
partly about that.
Yeah.
But of course, all of that is just nobody talks about it anymore because that's, I mean, the people who won were the people who did those things
Yeah.
because they had the money. They had money at the end of the day. So, I mean, absolutely. I mean, impossible for any of that to happen in China, by the way.
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, that kind of predatory capitalism is inconceivable in China today, which people always forget is a socialist country anyway. I mean, it hasn't, it beats to a different drum. I mean, that's the thing to understand. But no, I mean, but coming back to your question,
Mhm.
coming back to your point, my own personal view is that China's rise is not something we should try to stop.
No.
It is
Mhm.
something we should welcome.
Mhm.
If you're talking about the United States can be the future
Mhm.
if it works with China.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't.
Well, yeah, part of the reason I think
Yeah.
the forces within US that hate China is because China is different. Like
Yes.
private
Yes.
equities, they would want China to have private equities so they could
Yes.
go, making money there and
Well,
insert influence there. That's
yes.
part of the thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes.
Um, Britain now, is Britain on the verge of a bankruptcy? Is that right?
Right. Well, there's been this extraordinary statement by a group of economists,
Uh-huh.
um, and it's been published in certain British newspapers. Now, the economists in question, I've looked who they are. They are people who generally are very much politically on the right and
Hmm.
who are critical of the current government. And the newspapers that have been publicizing this article are also critical of the current government. So there is an element of political partisanship here. But it is nonetheless true that the
Hmm.
financial situation in Britain is very bad. And it was very interesting how the government responded to this story because instead of coming out and saying this story is absurd, what are
Hmm.
you talking about? We are
Hmm.
perfectly, the situation here is completely stable. These economists are fools to write this. This newspaper that's published this story is being ridiculous. The government instead avoids talking about this and is trying to bury the story, which makes one think that there might be something to it. Now, debt to GDP ratio in Britain is around 100%. We
Okay.
don't have domestic savings. I mean, in China, China has enormous domestic savings.
Yeah.
In Britain, not only do we not have domestic savings, but like the United States, most of the population is in debt. So we don't have that enormous resource that we can call in.
Hmm.
The financial system is overstressed and overstrained. Industry is in decline.
Hmm.
Energy costs are extremely high. The country is running a very, very big budget deficit, and it is running a very, very big trade deficit as well. And the trade deficit has been there for as long as I can remember. So these are all accumulating problems, and they are getting worse all the time.
Hmm.
Now, it could be that we will see a financial crisis in the autumn. I'm not saying it's
Hmm.
not going to happen. I don't know.
Hmm.
But I think that sooner or later, if we continue on this course, that financial crisis will come. I mean, it is inevitable.
And the British government is not doing anything to prevent
No,
it.
no, that is perhaps what triggered this letter, because
Okay.
one doesn't get a sense that the British government has any real plan about what to do. They attempted to shave some money off the welfare bill a few
Hmm.
months ago. If you remember, there was,
Hmm.
and the British Parliament rejected it. So they weren't able to do that. They're talking about raising taxes, but the kind of taxes they're talking about are taxes which will everybody agrees will further lower the level of growth.
Hmm.
There is no plan to raise productivity in Britain. Um, Wages in Britain are stagnant or falling. Young people are losing confidence. Many of them are dropping out of the uh, employment system. Many of them are choosing to live on benefits. And one shouldn't be too critical, because when there is little hope of any improvement,
Hmm.
that is what people tend to do. That is putting more stress on the benefit system, and it becomes a self reinforcing cycle. So there is no real sense that the government understands, really has a deep understanding of the problem, or really knows how to find a way through. It doesn't have a plan.
Hmm.
And by the way, no other government in Europe has a plan either. There is no plan anywhere in Europe to do anything to raise productivity and to improve living standards and to address the many major problems that we have. All of them probably could be addressed. We're still a very rich part of the
Hmm.
world,
Hmm.
but we don't seem to have any plan to put together to try to do anything about this.
But they have planned to deploy troops in
They
Ukraine.
have planned to deploy troops. They're giving $1 billion a month to Zelensky to buy weapons. The German government, which also has financial problems, is going to give Zelensky, the Ukrainians, $9 billion a year. Britain gives Ukraine £5 billion a year. Not that much less, about $7 billion a year. We continue to talk about rearmament. Not that anybody really believes that that's going to happen.
Mhm.
We want to send our warships to China, to the Chinese seas. We talk in these utterly self-destructive ways. And of course, we impose sanctions. We impose sanctions on the Russians. We won't buy Russia's oil and gas, so that our energy costs in Britain, by the way, they're about the highest in the world. Just to
Uh-huh.
say,
Uh-huh.
we have extraordinarily high energy costs, and we're now talking and experimenting about tariffs against China again. And the Europeans are talking about doing, trying to prevent China, the threat from China and all of that. We're doing all of those things to ourselves instead.
There's also a dispute now about the embassy. China acquired a piece of land. It's the former Royal Mint in London. They
Mm.
spent, I think, 225 million pounds
Pound.
on that.
Yeah.
At the time when they bought it, I think the British government was assisted with this purchase
Mm.
with the
Yeah.
goal of building the new embassy there. But it's still
Mm.
not built, right?
Mm.
They encounter all kinds of problems for building an
Yeah.
embassy. Why
Yeah.
is the British government, so why do they not helping China for this embassy? Why does there so much I mean, that they when they bought it, it's for building the embassy. And my understanding is the reason is that right now the Chinese embassy is too small, so they have different
Yeah.
offices scattered over the place, and so they want to put everything together. That was the
Yeah.
idea. Why is the British government doesn't do this? I mean, apparently under the Geneva Convention, that was required. The host
Yeah.
country supposed to support and help, guest country
Yeah.
in this case China for these activities. Why is the British
Well,
government is hostile to this?
big because of the absurd influence of people like Ian Duncan Smith, whom I was talking about before, and other people here. We have this extraordinary attitude that China is the enemy and we must keep the enemy at bay. And we mustn't let the Chinese build a big embassy, because if we build an embassy, if the Chinese build a big embassy here, well, it will mean that China is getting strong and powerful and is a country that perhaps we should look to. So the Americans can build. First of all, the Americans in the 60s bought a plot of land in Grosvenor Square, um,
Mhm.
one of the most beautiful squares in London, and they knocked down a whole section of it and they built a monster there, which is this horrible embassy building that they had and occupied. And now the Americans, this huge building isn't big enough for them. So they built another even bigger building somewhere else. And it is enormous and it's surrounded by a moat and, electrified fences and guard posts and all of that.
Mhm.
We don't object to that. But the Chinese building an embassy, that is unacceptable. By the way, I'm probably the only person in Britain who remembers this. But this story, which I've been reading about in the media, by the way, and there's a lot about it in the British media about how terrible it is that the Chinese own the Royal Mint, and what a humiliation for Britain
Uh-huh.
that is, and that the Chinese shouldn't be able to do that. I remember exactly the same thing that China is now facing with its embassy in London happened to the Soviet Union in the
Okay.
1970s. The
Mhm.
Soviets also had exactly the same problem. Their embassy building, which is the same embassy building they have now, was too small. They had all their different buildings
Mhm.
scattered all over the
Yeah.
place. They couldn't coordinate, they couldn't work together. So they bought an old plot of land in Kensington, part of London,
Mhm.
a series of stable blocks which had become completely derelict, and they wanted to build a new embassy there. And again, they paid money to buy this place. And again, the same people, the ancestors of the people who today are complaining about the Chinese embassy, were then complaining about the Soviet embassy, and it was
Mhm.
called the Kensington Kremlin. I remember all of that vividly. And there was a big campaign, and there was objections, and eventually a legal order was made to stop the Russians building this embassy. And it was said that this embassy would be too big and it would
Uh-huh.
tower over
Uh-huh.
London and it would make the British feel like a subject and oppressed people. And I'm sure they're saying the same about the Chinese embassy today. And by the way, if you go to that place where the Russians tried to build their embassy back in the 70s, today it is a hotel building, an American hotel building was built there, which must be about 50 times bigger than the embassy that the Russians were intending to build. I think because in the end, China does still have more traction than the Soviet Union did. And of course, economically, we are dependent
Mhm.
on trade with China in a way that we never were with the Soviets. Eventually, the Chinese will get their embassy. But I mean, as I said, this
Mhm.
is what happens. I mean, it's we were talking about the deep state earlier. You see,
Yeah.
the deep state. It's
Uh-huh.
the same continuity, the same policies, the same hostility
Mhm.
to non-Western countries that challenge you. The Russians weren't allowed to build their embassies, so why
Mm.
should the Chinese?
The interesting thing is now the Britain want to rebuild their embassy in Beijing now. So
Yeah,
now Beijing said no.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So
Yes, yes, exactly. Well, that's where, by the way, China is so much stronger than the Russians, because the Russians are always nervous about saying no
uh-huh.
about things like this, whereas
Uh-huh.
China doesn't have,
Yeah.
does it without embarrassment.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very different. Chinese statements, by the way, and Russian ones are very different. I mean, the
Uh-huh.
Chinese are so much clearer. I mean, they're so much more direct than the Russians
Mm.
are.
Yeah. So I agree with you. I think eventually China will get an embassy, but probably
Yeah,
not without some pressure, some
yeah,
forces,
yeah,
counter
exactly,
forces. Yeah. Okay.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. Let's talk next week. Always a lot. Let's see what's things progress. There's so many things going on. So, okay.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful week. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.